The snow lay deep across the valley that morning, a pale silence pressing down on the world, as though heaven itself wished to smother every sound. The barn stood dark against the whiteness, its roof bowed beneath the weight, the door creaking in the wind. Inside, where the air smelled of hay, horseflesh and smoke gone cold, a young woman lay curled in the straw like a discarded doll, her fine skirts rumpled, her veil soiled, her boots flecked with mud. She had not meant to sleep there, not meant to fall so far, but exhaustion had claimed her after shame had driven her from town. Azalea Whitcomb stirred in her sleep, her breath a pale cloud in the frigid air. Her cheeks, once pampered with powders and the soft touch of maids, were blotched red with cold. She had been raised on lace and piano lessons, taught to smile with careful lips, to curtsy just so, yet here she lay in a stranger's barn, no husband to her name, no dignity she could still cradle without it cracking in her hands. The words she had heard only a day ago clung to her ears like frost. Unfit, unwanted, better sent back, a bride who brings shame instead of pride. She had walked until her feet could carry her no longer, until the snow swallowed her prince, and she collapsed in the nearest shelter she found. The door groaned open, light and cold rushing in together. A shadow filled the threshold, tall and still as the pines outside. He ducked his head, stepped inside, and the presence of him seemed to shift the air itself. He was broad-shouldered, bare-chested despite the winter, his skin bronzed and scarred, his long black hair loose around a stern face. Tahu Rivera, of the guerrilla Apache, had returned to his barn not expecting to find another living soul, least of all a young settler bride sprawled in his hay. He stood there a moment, watching her breathe. The horses shifted uneasily, sensing both her strangeness and his silence. His eyes, dark as river stone, softened just enough to betray the thought that crossed him. This one has fallen far. He stepped closer, the boards creaking under his weight. Azalea startled awake, the straw rustling loud in her ears. Her gaze leapt upward, finding the towering man above her. For a moment, she forgot the cold, forgot the ache in her limbs. She saw only the breadth of his chest, the stillness of his expression, the unreadable calm of his stare. She scrambled to sit, clutching at her skirt as though modesty could shield her from humiliation. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice hoarse, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the last shard of her pride. She tried to rise, but her legs trembled, failing beneath her. Tahu said nothing. His silence was heavier than any scolding, heavier than the laughter she had endured in Silverton Ridge when her intended groom refused her at the depot, claiming she was not what he had been promised. The townsfolk had whispered then, their faces turning away, and she had known she could not return home, not with her father's words echoing like a curse. "You will wed where we send you, or not at all." Now this stranger regarded her with eyes that pierced through shame, but did not mock it. He crouched, slow and measured, his great frame folding into stillness beside her. From a pouch at his belt, he drew a strip of dried venison, and set it on the straw between them. The simple gesture struck harder than pity, for it carried neither judgment nor demand. Azalea's throat ached as she stared at the offering. Hunger gnawed her belly, yet pride warred against it. To take his food was to admit she was no longer mistress of her own fate, but a beggar in a world that had already cast her aside. Still, her hand crept toward it, trembling, and when her fingers closed around the meat, hot tears sprang unbidden. She ate slowly, each bite tasting of survival and surrender. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing all tracks, all signs that she had once belonged elsewhere. The barn's silence wrapped around them, broken only by the soft sound of her chewing and the restless snort of horses. "You should not be here," she whispered after a long while, her voice carrying both apology and defiance. Tahu tilted his head slightly, as if weighing her words. Then he spoke, his tone low, each syllable measured like a stone set in place. "Yet here you are." The simplicity of it struck her harder than cruelty could have. Here she was, and no denial could erase it. She lowered her eyes, shame coursing through her veins like frost. He stood, his shadow stretching long across the straw. Without another word, he moved to tend the horses, his hands practiced and sure, as though her presence were no more disruption than the wind outside. She watched him, puzzled by his indifference. Men she had known before would have sought to scold, to claim, to wound her pride further. This one moved with quiet dignity, neither inviting her to stay nor forcing her to leave. In the hours that followed, she felt the warmth of the barn rise as the beasts breathed, as the walls held against the storm. Exhaustion pulled her back toward sleep, yet shame kept her eyes open, tracing the scars that crossed his back and shoulders, marks of battles he would never speak of. She wondered what burdens he bore, what silences he had learned to keep. In his presence, her own disgrace seemed both smaller and heavier, as if the world itself demanded she endure it rather than flee. When evening came, he lit a lantern, its glow turning the barn walls to gold. He brought no questions, no sermons, only silence and a steady watchfulness that unsettled her more than cruelty might have. She shivered beneath her torn cloak, and at last, with no ceremony, he lifted a horse blanket and draped it across her shoulders. The coarse wool scratched her skin, but the warmth made her throat ache with gratitude she dared not voice. Her eyelids grew heavy. As she drifted near sleep once more, she felt the truth settle like snow upon her heart. She could not return to Silverton Ridge. The gossip there would flay her alive, the whispers would cling forever, and the man who had spurned her would smirk at her humiliation. Better to vanish into the wilderness than endure that gaze again. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching across Tahu's scarred chest as he settled near the door, a sentinel against the night. Azalea pulled the blanket tight around her, her breath hitching with both fear and relief. For the first time since shame had driven her from the town, she felt a fragile thread of safety binding her to this place. Yet in that safety lingered the sharp edge of uncertainty. She did not know what he intended, nor why his silence seemed to weigh heavier than chains. She only knew this. When morning came, she would have to choose whether to face the world beyond the barn, or to remain in the company of this man whose presence could not be ignored. And as her eyes closed, she heard his voice, deep and certain, breaking the long hush for the first time since evening fell. "From now on you're mine." The words did not thunder, they whispered, steady as snow falling on a frozen world. And though she trembled, part of her wondered if belonging might be found not in the approval of townsfolk, but in the vow of a man who spoke little and meant every word. The storm did not let up through the night, and by morning the barn seemed swallowed whole by snow. The boards groaned beneath the weight, the cracks stuffed with white. Azalea stirred from her uneasy rest, the coarse blanket still clutched at her shoulders. For a moment, she thought herself still in her father's house, curled by the hearth, but then the smell of hay and the sight of rough-hewn beams returned her to truth. Across the dim space, Tahu stood with his back to her, working at the door latch, testing it against the pressure of the drifts. His silence pressed heavier than the storm. She sat up, clutching her skirts around her legs. Her pride begged her to rise, to gather herself and leave before he turned, and reminded her that she did not belong. But her body betrayed her. Her feet were numb, her stomach hollow. A sound escaped her lips, half hunger, half shame. Without looking, he reached for a tin plate resting on the workbench and set it near her. A heel of bread, some venison, and a cup of water. He did not speak, only returned to his work, but the gesture carved into her heart with startling force. She could not recall the last time a man had offered her something without demand tied to it. Her intended in Silverton Ridge had given her only disdain. Her father had given her away like a coin spent. But here, in the cold of a stranger's barn, she received bread without words. Her hands trembled as she ate, every bite feeling both salvation and surrender. She did not thank him aloud. She could not. Gratitude lodged in her throat like a stone. Yet when she risked a glance, she found his eyes had turned toward her at last, studying her with an unreadable calm. She flushed and lowered her gaze, feeling her humiliation burn hotter than the small fire in her belly. The day stretched in long silences. He mended tack at the workbench, his broad hand steady, while she tried to make herself smaller in the corner. Every scrape of leather, every breath of wind through the eaves, filled the barn with a rhythm that seemed older than speech. She felt herself an intruder in a world that did not need her. And yet, when she watched him, she saw not disdain but endurance carved deep into the set of his shoulders. The scars across his chest caught the light of the lantern, reminders of battles fought without witnesses to tell of them. By afternoon, her pride cracked further. She rose unsteadily, drawn by a need she could not name. The horses stamped in their stalls, and she moved to them, stroking a mare's coarse mane. It gave her hand something to do besides tremble. When she looked back, Tahu's gaze rested on her again, unreadable but not harsh. Emboldened, she found a broom leaning in the corner and began to sweep the straw. The motion steadied her, each stroke of the broom a small reclaiming of dignity. He watched in silence, but when she tired and leaned against the handle, he approached. She stiffened, expecting correction, perhaps command. Instead, he took the broom from her gently, set it aside, and placed a rough spun shawl over her shoulders. It smelled faintly of cedar smoke. Her lips parted, but no words came. The simple kindness sank deeper than any conversation could. That night, the lantern glowed again, its flame painting the walls amber. Azalea sat on a low stool near the horses, her fingers clumsy as she stitched a tear in her skirt. She pricked her finger, hissed softly, and dropped the needle. Tahu's shadow moved across her before she could retrieve it. He crouched, found the needle between the boards, and set it in her palm without comment. Their fingers brushed, and she felt warmth flare through her, even as shame reminded her she had no right to feel it. When sleep pressed at her eyes, she heard him shift the hay near the door, settling himself as sentinel once more. The sight struck her oddly. He, a man carved of stone and silence, choosing the floorboards over the comfort of his own home while she sheltered in his barn. She wondered if it was mistrust, or a strange kind of respect, that kept him near but not nearer. The question curled inside her, restless. On the third day, she ventured outside, the snow blinding, the cold sharp as knives. She only meant to breathe fresh air, but her foot slipped on ice and she nearly fell. His hand caught her arm before she struck the ground. The strength in his grip startled her, yet he steadied her with gentleness, setting her upright. For the first time, she dared meet his eyes full on. They were dark, but not cruel, steady as a river's current, deep enough to drown in. Something shifted then, not in words but in the quiet between them. She no longer felt merely a trespasser, though shame still clung like frost to her heart. She felt tethered, however fragile the rope. Yet the world beyond the barn was not so silent. On the fourth day, as she dozed against the stall door, voices drifted from beyond the snow. Men from town, their tones sharp with suspicion, passed along the road. She could not make out the words, but she heard her name, bitter as ash. The gossip had reached here, to the wild edges where she had thought herself hidden. Heat rose to her cheeks, her pulse quickening with dread. Tahu, who had been splitting kindling, paused and looked toward the sound. His jaw tightened, though he made no move to confront. Instead he glanced back at her, his eyes steady, his silence speaking louder than fury could. She pressed her hands together, her heart aching. The barn had become her shelter, yes, but the world would not let her hide forever. She understood then that the true storm was not the snow, but the judgment waiting just beyond its drifts. That night, as the lantern burned low, she lay awake beneath the horse blanket, listening to his even breathing near the door. The gossip clung to her ears, cruel whispers promising to follow her wherever she went. She longed to ask him what he thought, whether he would cast her out to spare himself their scorn. But her pride bit her tongue, and so she said nothing. The silence stretched until at last, his voice came, low and certain, breaking the stillness like a strike of flint. "They will come here soon." Her breath caught. She turned toward him, but his face remained in shadow. The words carried no fear, only truth. And she knew, with a chill deeper than snow, that the barn was no longer just her refuge. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The snow broke at last, leaving the world silver and raw beneath a hard blue sky. Smoke rose thin from cabins in Silverton Ridge, carrying with it the smell of bacon grease and wood ash, the simple proof of ordinary lives. Azalea had not wished to go, but hunger and necessity drove her. She clutched her shawl tighter, her steps faltering as she walked beside Tahu down the frozen path that wound toward the town. Each crunch of her boots echoed in her chest, each step a reminder that she had no place waiting there but judgment. Tahu said nothing, his stride long and measured, the set of his jaw immovable as stone. She wondered if he felt the sting of the eyes they would meet, or if he had grown so used to their disdain that it no longer cut. For her, the thought of those whispers, the tilt of women's heads, the smirk of men at corners, burned worse than the cold air scalding her lungs. The first face appeared as they entered the main street. Martha Calloway, her bonnet tipped back, her mouth curving sharp as a knife. She nudged the woman beside her, words spilling low but bright as broken glass. Azalea caught the fragments. Fallen, disgrace, savage's bed. Heat surged up Azalea's neck, though her hands were stiff with cold. She wished to shrink into herself, to vanish into snowdrift, but Tahu's hand brushed lightly at her elbow, steadying her without claiming. The gesture anchored her, though it did not ease the shame. They passed the mercantile, where Sheriff Callum Briggs leaned in the doorway, arms folded across his broad chest. His eyes were narrow, his voice rough as gravel. "Didn't think I'd see you back here, Miss Whitcomb." The title dripped irony. His gaze flicked to Tahu. "Or you keeping her company, Rivera? That'll stir talk." Tahu did not answer. He only held the sheriff's stare with that river-dark silence of his, unyielding, until Briggs shifted against the doorframe, unsettled by the absence of submission. Azalea wished she had that silence, wished she could wear it like armor. Instead, she lowered her gaze and murmured, "I only came for flour." The sheriff grunted, stepping aside, though his eyes followed them like storm clouds. Inside the mercantile, the warmth of the stove should have soothed her, yet the air pricked with stares sharper than sleet. A pair of women whispered near the shelves, their eyes flicking between her and the tall figure at her side. The shopkeeper, Mr. Ellery, hesitated when she asked for provisions, his hands fumbling as though her coins might burn him. Her pride wavered, but she forced her chin to lift, the motion small but defiant. She would not beg. She would not cower, not in front of those who had once smiled at her when she carried her father's name like a banner. She gathered the flour, salt, and beans, her hands steady though her heart beat wild. When they stepped back into the street, the whispers followed like wolves. Eli Drummond stood by the hitching post, his face hard, his breath steaming in the cold. He had once written her letters filled with promises, a man she had nearly considered, before her father sold her future elsewhere. Now his voice carried across the street, sharp and cruel. "Didn't take long for you to crawl to him, did it? Couldn't keep one man, so you found another. Figures." Azalea froze, the words slicing deep, but before she could answer, Tahu stepped forward, his height casting Eli into shadow. He did not raise his fists, did not draw the knife at his belt. He only looked, silent and unflinching, until Eli's bravado cracked, and he spat in the snow instead of her face. Still, the wound was struck. The whole town had heard. The shame wrapped around her like chains, even as Tahu guided her away. Back in the shelter of the trees, her breath broke, shuddering against the frozen air. "They'll never stop," she whispered, her voice raw. "They'll always see me as ruined. And you." She turned, words trembling on her tongue. "They will call you worse for sheltering me." Tahu regarded her quietly, his eyes unreadable, but in their depth she saw neither regret nor hesitation. At last he said, "Let them speak." His tone was low, carved of stone. "Words are wind. They pass." She wanted to believe him. Yet words had driven her from her father's home, stripped her of a husband before she ever had one, cast her into this winter exile. Words had power. Words lingered. And she feared the town would not rest until their whispers became stones. That evening, in the cabin that smelled of cedar and smoke, Azalea lit the lamp while he worked at the hearth. The flour she had bought rested on the table, the beans soaking in a bowl. She should have felt relief, but her mind throbbed with every cruel phrase she had heard. Shame curled tight inside her, and for the first time, tears welled unchecked. She turned away, but his hand brushed her shoulder, steady and warm. When she looked back, she saw not pity in his eyes but recognition, as if he too had carried the weight of scorn and learned to walk beneath it. For a moment, the fire's glow wrapped them both, the silence more intimate than words could ever be. Still, the world outside did not vanish. She knew the whispers would grow teeth. She knew Eli Drummond's anger would not cool, nor Sheriff Briggs's suspicion wane. She knew Martha Calloway would sew her disgrace into every quilt of gossip the town could stitch. And in the face of it, she had only the shelter of one man's silence, one man's steady hand. As the night deepened, wind pressed hard at the shutters, rattling them like bones. Azalea sat close to the fire, her shawl drawn tight, listening to the storm gather once more. Tahu's shadow stretched across the wall as he set another log to flame. The crackle filled the space between them, warm yet restless. She wanted to ask him what he saw in her, why he allowed her to remain when the whole world scorned her presence. But her lips would not form the question. Instead, she studied the scars along his arm, the way they caught the lamplight like silver threads in dark cloth. She wondered how many battles he had endured in silence, how many storms he had weathered without seeking shelter in another soul. Her chest tightened with something close to longing, though fear and shame still bound her tongue. She lowered her gaze, clutching the shawl, and listened as the shutters rattled again. This time, the sound was not only wind. Beneath it, she heard the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. Slow, deliberate, drawing nearer to the cabin. Her breath caught, and she lifted her eyes to Tahu. He had already turned toward the door, his body gone still as stone, the firelight sharpening the edge of his features. The whispers of the town had not stayed in town. They had come to their door. The footsteps circled the cabin once before fading back into the storm. Azalea sat rigid by the fire, her shawl clutched at her throat, waiting for a knock that never came. Tahu did not move from his place near the door until the silence outside was complete, until even the wind seemed to ease its howl. Then he returned to the hearth, placing another log upon the flames, his expression carved in calm. Yet she saw the tightness at his jaw, the readiness in his body, as if he knew the storm beyond their walls was not yet spent. In the days that followed, the snow deepened, the world narrowing to the glow of the fire and the labor of survival. Azalea learned to tend the kettle, to slice beans and knead bread with stiff hands that once only held embroidery needles. The rhythm steadied her, and each small act stitched a fragile sense of belonging. She swept the floor until her shoulders ached, patched his worn shirt with uneven stitches, and fed the horses with clumsy care. Though her work was imperfect, Tahu never corrected, never mocked. He simply watched, his gaze steady, his silence holding weight she could not name. At times she caught him studying her, as though testing whether she would endure this life. Each glance pressed against her pride, daring her to prove she was more than the whispers that had followed her from Silverton Ridge. And slowly, she found that she wanted to. Not for her father's honor, not for the town's approval, but for herself, and perhaps in some unspoken way for him. One evening, the sun bled low through the snow clouds, turning the world beyond the window into molten gold. Azalea sat close to the fire, mending the hem of her skirt, while Tahu worked at the table, shaping arrow shafts with steady hands. The light caught on his scars, tracing them like rivers across his skin. She wanted to ask of them, of the battles he had faced, of the silences he carried. But her voice faltered at the edge of curiosity, for fear he might turn away. Instead, she spoke softly of her mother, long gone, who had once sung her to sleep with hymns. The words felt fragile, but they broke the hush like water striking dry earth. Tahu's head lifted. His eyes met hers, and though he did not speak of his own losses, she felt the weight of them in the depth of his gaze. It was enough. A quiet understanding bridged the space between them, built not of declarations but of presence. She felt her shame soften, as though the fire's warmth had reached the coldest parts of her soul. But the outside world did not rest. On the fifth evening, as shadows stretched long, voices gathered beyond the cabin. Azalea's heart leapt as she recognized Eli Drummond among them, his tone sharp and bitter. Others answered him. 3, perhaps 4 men, their boots crunching against the frozen ground, their words thick with drink and malice. Tahu rose, his body taut as a drawn bow. He took up his rifle but did not raise it, only rested it across his arms as he stepped outside. Azalea followed to the doorway, fear clutching her ribs. The men stood in the snow, their breath steaming, their eyes hard. Eli stepped forward, his lip curled. "She doesn't belong here. Everyone knows it. Send her out, Rivera. Let her face her shame like a woman should, not hide behind you." Azalea's breath hitched, her throat tight. She expected Tahu to answer, to fight, to rage. But he only stood, silent and immovable, the storm itself given flesh. His silence unsettled them more than fury would have. Eli's bravado faltered under the weight of that gaze, but he rallied with a sneer. If she stays with you, the whole town will turn against you both. Still Tahu said nothing. Instead, his hand lifted, a single gesture beckoning Azalea forward. Her legs shook, but something in his eyes steadied her. She stepped into the snow, her breath a trembling cloud. The men's stares bit into her, but she lifted her chin, her voice thin but unbroken. I will not go with you. The silence that followed felt vast, the snow muffling even the wind. Eli's face twisted, disbelief warring with anger. You choose him. His words spat her shame into the air, daring her to crumble. But she did not. Though her hands trembled, she stood beside Tahu, her shoulder brushing his arm. The men muttered, uncertain, their courage unraveling. Eli cursed, turning on his heel, and the group trudged back into the night. Their threat lingered, but for now the storm had passed. Back inside, Azalea sank onto the stool by the fire, her whole body shaking. Tahu set his rifle aside and draped a quilt around her shoulders. She pressed her face into the rough fabric, tears hot against her skin. I don't know how to be brave, she whispered. You were, he answered simply, his voice low and steady. Bravery is not the absence of fear. It is standing when fear tries to silence you. The words sank deep, settling in places long hollow. She lifted her gaze to him, and in that moment, something shifted. He was no longer merely her shelter. He had become the measure by which she judged herself. His presence did not erase her shame, but it gave her the strength to rise within it. The days that followed carried a new rhythm. She laughed once, softly, when his horse nudged her shoulder, and the sound startled her, for she had not heard her own laughter in months. He watched her then, a faint curve at his lips, fleeting but real. She found herself waiting for those moments, the small mercies that threaded warmth through the cold. Yet the shadow of the town did not fade. At the edge of her thoughts lingered Eli's words, the sheriff's suspicion, the sharp tongues of women who had nothing to lose by tearing her name apart. She knew their whispers would not end with snow. They would come again, louder, with fire behind them. On the 10th night, as the fire burned low, Azalea sat with the quilt wrapped around her, watching Tahu carve a small figure from wood. His hands were steady, his expression calm. She wondered if he carved to quiet storms inside himself, as she mended her skirts to quiet hers. The figure took shape, a bird, wings spread, caught in mid-flight. He set it on the table, and the lamplight kissed its form. She reached out, touched the smooth curve of its wing. It looks free, she murmured. His eyes lifted, meeting hers, and the fire caught in them. It is, he said. The quiet stretched, thick with something unspoken, until the sound of boots in snow cut through it. This time there were many, more than 4, perhaps 10. Voices rose, harsher, closer, fueled not by drink alone but by purpose. Azalea's hand froze on the carved bird. The fire crackled, the shutters rattled, and Tahu rose once more, silent and steady, his shadow vast against the wall. The storm was no longer at the door. It was upon them. The wind roared against the cabin walls, a blizzard swallowing the night in white fury. The voices outside rose above the storm, rough and determined, men hardened by whiskey and resentment. Azalea's breath caught in her chest as she clutched the quilt around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Tahu's silhouette by the door. His stillness was more frightening than rage, as though he had been waiting all his life for this moment to come. The first fist slammed against the wood, rattling the frame. Send her out. Eli Drummond's voice cut sharp, venom laced with triumph. She belongs to no one but shame. You hide her, you shame yourself. Azalea flinched, her body trembling, but Tahu did not move. He opened the door into the storm, and the blizzard poured inside, snowflakes spinning like ash. 10 men stood in the yard, rifles slung, faces twisted with cold and malice. Their lanterns swung in the wind, halos of orange against the dark. Eli stepped forward, his smirk cruel, his eyes glittering. Tahu's bare chest rose steady with breath, his body towering against the storm. He did not speak at first, only let the silence weigh heavy. Then his voice came low, thunder beneath the wind. She stays. A ripple of unease ran through the group, but Eli barked a laugh to cover it. "You'll bleed for her, then." He gestured, and the men moved closer, boots crunching in the snow. Azalea's heart pounded. She wanted to cry out, to plead for mercy, but something in Tahu's stance held her tongue. He stepped into the yard, snow swirling around his frame, his skin shining in the lantern glow. The first man lunged, and Tahu's fist met him like a hammer, sending him sprawling into the drift. Another swung the butt of a rifle, but Tahu ducked, seized the weapon, and wrenched it free, tossing it into the storm. The yard erupted in chaos. Men shouted, boots stamped, snow churned beneath their struggle. Tahu moved with terrifying grace, each motion born of discipline and survival. His silence was more dreadful than their curses, his strength unyielding. Yet numbers pressed hard. 2 men caught his arms, trying to drag him down, while Eli strode toward the open door, his gaze fixed on Azalea. She froze, the quilt slipping from her shoulders. Eli's sneer deepened as he reached for her, his hand outstretched to seize her wrist. "You think he'll save you? He'll be nothing but blood in the snow." Something fierce rose in her then, stronger than fear, sharper than shame. She seized the lantern from the table, its flame flickering wild, and hurled it at him. It burst against his coat, fire licking bright across the wool. Eli screamed, stumbling back into the snow, his men rushing to smother the flames. The distraction gave Tahu the moment he needed. He broke free of the grip on his arms, his fists a storm of their own, striking until the yard lay littered with groaning figures. The blizzard swallowed their cries, the snow already covering their tracks. Eli thrashed in the drift, his coat smoldering, his pride burned deeper than his skin. His eyes met Azalea's, filled with hate and disbelief. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice hoarse, before he staggered into the dark, his men dragging him away. The storm closed behind them, silence rushing in as though the earth itself exhaled. Tahu stood in the snow, his chest heaving, blood streaked across his knuckles. Azalea stepped into the doorway, her breath trembling, her hands still shaking from the lantern she had thrown. Their eyes met, the world narrowing to that single tether between them. He walked back to her slowly, snow clinging to his hair, his body a wall of strength and weariness. When he reached the door, she reached out without thought, her fingers brushing the scars on his chest. "You stood for me," she whispered, her voice breaking. His hand rose, rough and steady, cupping her cheek. "You stood too." The words undid her. She leaned into him, her tears hot against the cold night. For the first time, she did not feel ruined, did not feel cast aside. She felt chosen, not by a town's approval, not by her father's bargains, but by a man whose silence carried more truth than all their words. They stepped inside, shutting the storm behind them. The fire still burned, casting its glow on the carved bird at the table, wings forever spread as though caught in flight. Azalea touched it, her hand steady now. "I want to belong here," she said softly, the confession trembling but real. Tahu's eyes held hers, unflinching, and he gave the smallest nod. "Then you do." The blizzard howled against the walls, but inside, the cabin glowed with a warmth that felt unshakable. The storm had not broken them, it had bound them. Azalea sank by the fire, her body trembling with both exhaustion and release. Tahu settled near, his presence a shield, his silence no longer a void but a promise. She thought of the whispers in town, the faces twisted with judgment, and for the first time they did not pierce her. Their voices might return, sharper than ever, but she would not walk bowed beneath them. For she had stood in the snow and refused to be taken. She had fought for herself, even if only with a single lantern thrown. And she had found in Tahu not a rescuer, not a captor, but a man who saw her beyond disgrace. The fire crackled, the wind battered, and she leaned against his shoulder, letting her breath steady at last. A fragile peace wrapped around them, tender and fierce. Yet in her heart, she knew the storm outside was not the last. The town would come again, louder, with more than whispers. But as she closed her eyes against the firelight, she understood something vital. She no longer faced it alone. And when Tahu's voice broke the hush, low and steady, it sealed the truth she had only begun to believe. "From now on," he whispered, his breath warm against her hair, "we stand together." The storm raged on, but within those words, she felt the world shift, felt herself rise from shame into something stronger. For belonging was no gift from others. It was the fire two souls kept alive against the snow.